Hi, everybody, and welcome to the virtual exhibit, Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics, curated by Bruno, Latour, and Peter Weibel, and Bettina, Korintenberg, and Martin Guinard. It's my pleasure to introduce Lou Derry, who will be giving opening remarks about this event before the actual tour, which is given by Barbara Kiolbassa. So, Lou Derry is a professor of geological sciences at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and a professor associate at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris. He is the director of the Critical Zone Observatories National Office, supported by the US NSF, and a PI in the Make Our Planet Great Again program of the Agence Nationale de la Recherche, which is in France. His research interests include coupled geochemical and hydrological processes in the critical zone, modeling the global carbon cycle over multiple timescales, and the relationship between landscape evolution and hydrological and geochemical fluxes. His teaching and outreach interests currently include using environmental studies to inspire mathematics learning at the undergraduate level and developing hands-on and web-delivered demonstrations of critical zone and climate change science for secondary and undergraduate education. He is a Fellow of the Geological Society of America and a Fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and co-editor-in-chief for the Journal of Earth and Planetary Science Letters. Lou, thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Selena. I'll try to provide a little context on how we think of the critical zone as a scientific community and why we think it's important, and I'll be happy to take some questions or some discussion after that. I'm going to share my screen to show you a couple images because we earth scientists can't speak without images. That and let's see. Hopefully, this comes up here in a moment. There we go. Okay, is that all good? So
Absolutely.
What we see here today is a little cartoon diagram of the critical zone. It's really the interface between the atmosphere and the geosphere, with mediated by water, plants, all sorts of activity. So it's sometimes referred to as a zone where rock meets life. It's a permeable layer which extends from the top of the trees down to the bottom of the groundwater, and this is a zone where all sorts of important things happen, both for natural ecosystems, for human habitation, and for what we refer to as managed ecosystems, where humans are the dominant actor in the system. Give a few reasons why we think the critical zone is particularly important. And so obviously it's the place where we grow our food, whether it's in managed cropping systems or even if you're a hunter-gatherer society. The critical zone also is our source of drinking water, either in streams and lakes or groundwater resources. And the function of the critical zone, one of the key functions, is that it supplies the nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems, again, whether they're anthropogenically influenced or whether they're natural. So it's a very dynamic place. The exchange of material in the critical zone with the rest of the environment is very rapid. And so, for example, more than half of the rainfall that lands on the Earth's surface every year is recycled fairly quickly back to the atmosphere by the function of plants in the critical zone. The rest of it, some of it goes to recharge groundwater resources and some runs off in stream water. But the exchange between the atmosphere in terms of precipitation and the critical zone and the evapotranspiration that returns that water is a very large flux. And that has a big impact on climate because it helps control the water vapor in the lower atmosphere, which is important. The critical zone stores about 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere does. If you include permafrost, it's more like 7 times more carbon. And about 15% of the entire atmospheric CO2 reservoir cycles through the critical zone every year. So every 7 or 8 years or so, on average, effectively the entire atmosphere cycles through the critical zone. So these numbers are large fractions of the total, and that means that modest changes in the way the critical zone operates can, even over a few years, and certainly over a few decades, can have major consequences for the distribution and availability of water and for atmospheric CO2 and for climate. So imagine if we were to increase the amount of carbon that the critical zone released a little bit every year. In a relatively small number of years, that can make a big impact on the atmosphere and increase atmospheric CO2 even more than it's already being increased. At the same time, as climate does change, the critical zone responds, and the way water moves through the critical zone and water quality are functions of climate as well. So the critical zone hosts a lot of complex interactions between the climate system, between biology at both the micro scale with microbes and fungi and the macro scale with large trees and grasslands, water in many ways, soils and soil development. The geology, underlying geology, is very important. It varies quite a lot from place to place. And finally, the carbon system, which we just talked about. So the complexity of these interactions is such that we can't easily just sit down and model them. We need to observe them. We need improved understanding. We need better data so that we can have better tools to predict how this critical zone, which is so critical, will respond to and in turn modulate climate change. So it's really something that's essential, and we are dealing with a complex animal about which we don't know enough yet. So here's an example of here's a map of critical zone observatories in the United States. About 15 years ago, a little over 15 years ago, the idea of the critical zone as a separate field of study began to gain currency in the scientific community. And the U.S. National Science Foundation initially, and then a number of other scientific organizations internationally joined quickly thereafter, set up a series of observatories, a series of sites that could be heavily instrumented, that could bring together scientists with very different backgrounds: microbiologists, soil scientists, hydrologists, geochemists, atmospheric scientists, ecologists, all working on the same places to get the kinds of integrated expertise we needed in a few sites. Because I tell my graduate students, in order to work in this field, you have to know everything, but you can't. So you better have smart friends. You need to work very collaboratively in this field. So these are the 9 original U.S. critical zone observatories, or CZOs as they're known. They range from the West Coast all the way to Puerto Rico, and they cover a wide variety of environments. And they've been now active for over almost 15 years. This is a slide provided by my colleague Jérôme Gaillardet from Paris, and it shows, again, a sort of cartoon view of the critical zone in a big scale, with everything from mountain glaciation to agricultural fields, and the intersection between, we've talked about air, water, soil, biota, all these things. So we have hydrologic observatories. We have a network in France and in Europe of hydrologic observations, as well as biogeochemical observations and climate observations at the surface. The movement of water is really key to all this. And the French network is referred to as OSCAR. In French, the ZC is for the Zone Critique. And there are networks in Germany, the Tirreno network, and in China, and in a number of other countries that are increasingly integrated internationally. So this is, again, Jérôme's slide to give you an idea of the diversity of techniques and expertise that's brought in to study the critical zone. So we really see this as a field that requires lots of different kinds of tools, lots of different kinds of instrumentation, and lots of different people with different kinds of expertise who can contribute to an understanding of what's a very complicated thing. And we have lots of different environments, whether we look at rainforests in the tropics, or alpine systems, or heavily managed agricultural systems where the system is dominated by cropping and heavy fertilizer use and water diversion. All of these things are part of the critical zone. We have to understand them all, and there's a great deal of heterogeneity. So that's why we need an observing network, and that's why observations are really important. As smart as we think we are, we can't do much without a lot of observations to work with, because the system is complex and requires data to constrain it. So those are my sort of opening comments on this, and that's all I really want to say formally here. So I'm going to end the slideshow, and I'm going to stop sharing, and we can take some questions. Maybe other people can join in the discussion. Oh, there's Jérôme.
Wonderful. Hi, Jérôme. Thank you. I understand you had some technical difficulties joining this call, so thank you for Thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you here. We just heard from Dr. Derry. Everybody, this is Jérôme. You probably remember him from the panel, but I'll still briefly introduce him. Jérôme Gaillardet is a professor of earth sciences at the Institut de Physique de Global de Paris, where he is leading a research team on the Earth's surface geochemistry. He is also a member of the Institut Universitaire de France. He is working on biogeological cycles in the critical zone of the Earth, in particular on river geochemistry using isotopes. He has published more than 130 articles in peer-reviewed journals and contributed to a number of books. He has been involved in the development of critical zone observatories at the national, European, and international scale. He is coordinating the French network of critical zone observatories and is part of the European ELTER project. He has been awarded the Silver Medal of the French National Center for 14 Research CNRS in 2018. He is a fellow of the European Association of Geochemistry and American Geochemical Society. Jérôme, thank you for joining us today and saying a few words before Barbara presents the virtual exhibit.
Thank you for the invitation. I have nothing to add actually. After Lou's talk, I just want to say that we need, as Lou explained, we need networks of people. We need networks of sites because we need to connect the people, and because a critical zone can only be studied at the local scale. Building network that will compose the global picture is really the challenge, and so the different countries have tried different solutions for that. And Lou showed us what the USA did, which was funding the NSF funded sites in which all the disciplines will collaborate. So by a competitive process, the scientists promised to work on the same sites, but using different disciplines, different tools, different conceptual framework, blah blah blah. In Europe, and in particular in France, we did something else, and this is a slide that Lou showed, because we have a long history of existing sites which have been measuring different compartments of the critical zone, and of course it's not always at the same place. And actually, when you talk to scientists, and that's probably true for the other fields of science, arts, and sociology, for example, you cannot find an ideal place where you're going to study everything. The hydrologists have their own sites, which is not good for the geochemist because it's complicated for him. And then the ecologists, they have instrumented another site, which is not close, which is far from the previous one, etc., etc. So building a network is the only way you can put all these disciplines under the same umbrella. And of course, you need to make these people talk to each other, and you need to make these people exchange their techniques and models. So this is the way we have chosen in France to build a network of existing observatories to make interoperable database to connect people. So we'll see what the future will be in terms of observing the human habitat, because actually probably Lou said that, but the critical zone, it's where we live, humans. And so this is really the place on Earth we need to really monitor much better than what we've been doing so far. Okay, I think that's it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our virtual exhibit tour guide for the day, Barbara Kilobasa. Barbara Kilobasa has a master's in art and is a research associate at the ZKM Center for Arts and Media. She is part of the ZKM Museum Communication team, focusing on art education and participatory media art projects. For the exhibition, Critical Zones Observatories for the Earthly Politics, she coordinates the diverse educational program together with the ZKM exhibition team and has the pleasure of collaborating with numerous local initiatives from Karlsruhe. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this tour.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Selina, for introducing me and inviting me. And also a huge thank you to Jérôme and Louis for laying the foundation for the guided tour through the exhibition that is really moving us at the ZKM a lot right now. And maybe to pick it up where Louis and Jérôme left us, to us, what really fascinated us with the notion of the critical zone is that it is a way to see and think the world. So it's the place we live in, but it should also be the image, the first image that pops up in our mind when we think of the world. Because usually when you imagine the world, the image that is collectively implemented in our collective mind is the blue marble, the planet as seen from space. And this is an image that kind of suggests that we are outside, that there is an outside of our world, that we can look at it from a distance point of view. And the idea that we kind of had with the critical zone is that we have to land, we have to understand that there is no outside of the critical zone. We're in the middle of it, and this is how we should see and conceive of the world. So that was kind of the leading idea when we decided to do an exhibition about it. And it was really a challenge to transform the fragile and complex topics of the critical zone into an exhibition. So what I want to talk to you about today is how we can use the medium of an exhibition to shape an awareness for the critical zone. And usually I like to do my guided tours as a shared conversation, but I understand that it's a little bit difficult to unmute everybody. So just feel free to, at every point, write a question in the chat, and Selina will just read them out, interrupt me wherever I am, so that I can maybe, when we're looking at an artwork, directly engage with your question. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that everything works well technically. Oh, can you see my screen right now? Maybe a quick okay from Selina?
Yes, I can see it. It looks great.
Yeah? Okay. So I wanted to start with this image just to show you where I'm talking to you from, because I'm in the middle of Germany. It's a very grayish sky outside and it's raining. But on this image, you can see the ZKM, the Center for Arts and Media. And yeah, this is us. We're a center, more than a museum. We're working at the intersection of arts and media, science and technology. So it's really a privilege to be part of a scientific symposium today. And yeah, we're interested in understanding the current socio-political transformations of our society and offering a space for knowledge exchange and learning to a very broad public. So to us, the museum really serves as the commons, as an assembly. And earlier this year, in May, we wanted already to open this exhibition that is especially important to us, especially in this very strange year of 2020. So as Selina mentioned, it's called Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics. And we had been working on it together with the famous philosopher and sociologist Bruno Latour for over 2 years. Then the lockdown came, and for the first time in its history, the ZKM had to close its doors completely. But it was very obvious to us, though, that the COVID crisis was not at all a new topic, but on the contrary, it painfully revealed what the critical zone is made of: a web of entanglements, landscapes of intertwined dependencies where species, bodies, industry, food, landscapes, politics, ecosystems, health, economy, technology, all of that is tumbled together to form what Anna Tsing and others would call monsters of the Anthropocene. So it was really clear to us that we could not wait for COVID to pass or the lockdown to be over. We had to make this exhibition accessible as soon as possible. And that's how we ended up programming and designing an online experience in less than 5 weeks. And the challenge was to create an atmosphere that would work online and to let the constitution or the nature of Critical Zone inspire the way we programmed the code of this exhibition. And we had to work with a very limited time and a limited budget. And we also had to create something that would work on every device, so laptop and cell phone, So maybe I'm now going to like enter the exhibition, and maybe at first sight it doesn't really look like what you would expect. But another thought is also that understanding the critical zone really requires a different aesthetic, one that breaks with the established modes of storytelling as proposed by the dominant cultural production. That was also a thought that was mentioned earlier today, how important storytelling and aesthetics is. So this is how we enter the virtual exhibition. And the first thing we read is a quote by Lynn Margulis, a wonderful biologist whom I hope you have all heard of, where she wrote, "We are a part of an enormous ancient whole. Welcome to the critical zone." So that's kind of how we want to set the tone. And the nice thing is that every time you log into the exhibition, every time you enter the physical, the virtual space, there will be a new quote setting kind of the atmosphere. And the exhibition is visited through the mode of an endless scroll, which kind of also reflects on a feeling that we might all have and share in the new climatic regime, a feeling of being disorientated, of not knowing what will happen, of not knowing where it's actually going. And this is kind of what we're playing on with this scroll, where you just don't know when the end comes or what is coming up next. This is, as I already said, the title, but I want to mention also the design aspect of the typography, because it's from two graphic designers from Switzerland. And we chose this typography especially because it kind of mirrors the idea of shifting grounds or unstable grounds. Because when you start reflecting the way you see the world or you think the world, and you maybe start looking for a new position to reposition yourself inside this web of entanglements that is the critical zone, you might not really know where you stand at first. So that's what we're playing on. And the subtitle is already giving away a lot of key ideas of the exhibition. So first of all, earthly politics. That's really the core of the exhibition. We need an earthly politics, and one that is very flatly put, not attracted to leaving planet Earth and go and colonize Mars, nor one that wants to build walls around the idea of a gated territory, setting us back to the 19th century idea of the nation state with its terrible urge for colonies. So we need a new kind of politics. And right now, when we look at the politics that are happening, it feels like it's either this techno fix or it's either this idea of going back to, yes, walls. Another interesting point is that if you go and visit the exhibition a little later on by yourself, which I'm really recommending, you will see that it looks differently depending on what time zone you're in and what time of day it is. So there is a night mode to the exhibition, and right now this is the day mode. Because it's really important when you locate yourself, when you start observing, as Jérôme already said, it's necessary to observe the critical zone. You need to know exactly where you are and what time you are. So we're kind of playing on this idea of localization there. So yeah, we have also opened the physical exhibition in July. So kind of both exhibitions exist right next to each other. And here's an amazing feature, because it was really important to us to have an understanding that everything depends on each other and that we collaboratively share a space. And we wanted to show that many other entities are part. You're not alone when you're visiting the exhibition. So rather you are part of a reactive interface layer, as it says here. So artworks, archive materials, and events are entities, but also other visitors. And you can see us interacting here in the back, we're leaving traces for each other. And as it says, the exhibition is constantly evolving, and we can now start our field trip by just choosing one of these tags, and actually every entity that is part of the reactive interface layer is tagged so that everything depends on everything. Just like we heard before from Jackie Mohan, everything impacts everything. Everything is connected. That's also what makes the critical zone. And so that's kind of what we translated into the code of this exhibition. And now when we start, we see some or everything that is part of the exhibition. And I want to start with an artwork that, it's really interesting because every time you visit the exhibition, it will look differently, and you can never find the same way because it's not an idea of having a linear story that unfolds before your eyes, but it's always different. So that's why I might not find immediately the artwork I want to start with, and I have just saved it as a link to make it a little bit quicker. Because I want to start with an artwork that plays on or shows a critical zone observatory, just as Louis and Jérôme were talking about. And it's kind of an alternative map of such a critical zone observatory. And it maps the Strengbach catchment. It's a critical zone observatory in France, so it's not far away from where I'm speaking to you from. And as you can see, maybe it's kind of a difficult map to read. It looks a bit like data visualization or like different scales, but it doesn't really look like a map that we would be used to reading. And this is really the idea of the two artists who designed it, Sohail Ajmer-Baba and Alexandra Arène. And they wanted to map a critical zone observatory according to what data, what processes it visualizes. And they put, which is very interesting, in the middle, what is the most important part, the atmosphere. So instead of having the atmosphere on top or on the bottom or on the outside, it's really on the inside, the middle of the map. And then if you zoom in, you can see the measuring instruments, the stations of the catchment. And one station that I would like to point out is the River Lab. So the River Lab, which is really part of this outdoor critical zone observatory, is an extremely sensitive instrument that is located close to the watershed near the Strengbach River. And it analyzes the water and the evolution of 15 chemical elements in real time. And each element behaves differently and varies according to its rhythm, day and night rhythm, seasons, floods. And you can actually listen to the chemical elements that flow through the river. And I hope you can hear it right now. So this is an experiment in data visualization, and it makes us feel data in a different way through what you could call the river's chemical symphony. Another interesting station is the Spruce Tree Station, which we can see here. And it's a station where rain passing through the canopy is monitored and collected, and then analyzed in the laboratory, where you can kind of see with the data, you can measure the resilience of the critical zone also to past sulfur inputs. Because forest decline obviously has been observed for many decades, partly due to soil acidification, leading also to nutrients being washed out of the soil. And also in addition, the already weakened trees are strongly impacted by storms, hydric stress and drought and bark beetles. So it's really important to monitor the nutrient and the well-being of trees. And this is kind of what we see documented here. Okay, so that was kind of the first artwork that I wanted to share with you. And exactly, Pascal already wrote in the chat, I can just see it, that Sohail Ajmer-Baba will be giving a workshop tomorrow. So I warmly recommend to attend that one. The next artwork that I would like to share with you is part of a second chapter of the exhibition, which refers to ghost acreages. Ghost acreages is a term coined by Kenneth Pomeranz in his 2000 book, The Great Divergence. And you could translate this notion into, we don't live where we are, because we live off a land that we actually don't inhabit, especially in the Western world. We have no clear understanding of the soil, the landscapes, the labor that produce the resources that sustain us, actually. And oftentimes, also, these modes of productions still follow paths laid out in colonial times. That's also a big part of the critical zone, into what do we know, what do we see, what do we feel of the critical zone, and what parts of the critical zones are we connected to, and what parts do we even don't know, despite the fact that we sustain, that these are the parts that sustain us. So one artist who traces these lines and networks of terrestrial connections is Uriel Orloff, and he does so by exploring the links between plants, people, and history. I'm gonna click on his work, and I hope that it works and that you also hear there's a soundscape that he created with it. And he starts his story actually down here in the historical workers' gardens of a city outside of Paris in France called Aubervilliers, where in the 19th century, market gardeners of Paris had to settle in order to make space for the bourgeois who wanted to live in the city center. So the market gardeners were all driven out of Paris. And they located in Aubervilliers because there is very fertile soil. And they set up a cultivating technique which until 1900 provided over 90% of the vegetables sold at Les Halles in Paris, and which can thus be considered as a precursor of both intensive farming and permaculture. And people were really proud of the soil in Aubervilliers, which can be seen here actually in a detail of a stained glass window from the church in Aubervilliers. So you can see the crops shown at the feet of saints. But then obviously came industrialization, and with it the terrors of colonialism. And the workers' gardens in Aubervilliers, which kind of still exist today, but back then they were replaced by industrial fields. And the French colonial department created colonial test gardens, which we can see here. They were created so in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's actually interesting because plants would be shipped all the way from the Americas to these colonial test gardens in France. And from there, the crops or the seeds would be shipped to the newly set up test gardens in Dakar, Saint Louis, and elsewhere in West Africa. So back then, plants were then tagged exotic, useful, economic, or not. So these were new ways of categorizing plants. And still today, farms in West Africa produce almost exclusively for the European market. And for our exhibition, Uriel traced all of these networks back to Frankfurt Airport, which we can see up here, and which is about 1.5 hours away from Karlsruhe. And here you can see a historical view of these colonial test gardens. So it's really important to ask ourselves, what do we eat and where does it come from? And this is kind of the story that Uriel is tracing back. Another important fact about this is that most of these connections are completely invisible or made invisible through the global economy. So this chapter of the exhibition really urges us to relocate ourselves and understand what sustains us, and what we live from. So this is also why we have kind of small exercises that we hid everywhere in the exhibition, that whenever you visit the exhibition by yourself, you can try them out and do these little exercises, and maybe they will reshift your perspective on how you think the world, or how you think the land that you actually live from, which might not be the land that you live off. Another artwork that I would like to show is an artwork by Territorial Agency, and it's called Oceans in Transformation, the architecture of the continental shelf. And it's also along the lines of Uriel Orloff, that here they draw an alternative map. They say they focus on the ocean as a huge sensorium and regarding the fact that the ocean really records the transformation of the Earth and the climate in its complex circulations, energies, and ecologies. I'm going to click on the artwork and hope also that it works well. It's kind of heavily filled with data, so I hope you can see it without any glitches. So what territorial agency does is they create this alternative map in the sense of what Bruno Latour would call generating alternative descriptions. So the artist gathered as much information as possible on the entangled phenomena that shape the ocean using data from multiple research institutions like glacier monitoring, water quality, the activity of hot and cold water corals, wind energy, but also fishing and transshipment data, or oil drilling concessions and dredging and dumping data. And what we can see here is an alternative map of the ocean, an alternative description of a place we depend on, because obviously the oceans are keeping us alive. And in his latest book, Down to Earth, Latour states how important it is to redescribe the dwelling places, he calls them, that have become invisible. And he defines a dwelling place as, quote, that on which a terrestrial, so any living being in the critical zone, depends for its survival. And in order to describe one's dwelling place, we have to list all the things we need for our subsistence. That's also an exercise that every one of us should do. List all the things that we need for our subsistence and understand where they come from and understand what they in turn depend from. And that, according to Latour, would be the only way to understand what we need to protect and fight for. And that's precisely what territorial agency are doing with this alternative description of the dwelling place that is the ocean. And actually, you can also see the data sets that they're using if you click on data sets down here. So that's really interesting, and seeing how all of this data is influencing this alternative map that they have created. So there's a lot to discover there. I think I still have time for one last artwork, and I would really like to show it because it's such a different aesthetic again. And it also covers the third chapter of the exhibition, which really focuses on Gaia, Lynn Margulis, and how we are all holobionts, knowing that more than half our body is not human, but made out of bacteria and microbial organisms. So there's also an entire chapter on this platform about Lynn Margulis and her research. So I really recommend you to go and read it and listen to it, because it's absolutely fascinating. But I really wanted to share this work by the Taiwanese artist Chimelezai Dakibali, because it, on the one hand, illustrates beautifully the wonders of the microbial world, but on the other, it also shows how indigenous knowledge and vernacular stories can inform scientific knowledge. Because as Bruno Latour also says, when we are searching for an earthly politics, it's not about searching for one unifying view, but about a dispersion so as to explore as many sides and possibilities as possible. And Donna Haraway obviously would say, not only does it matter what stories tell stories, but especially whose stories tell stories. And Chimelezai did these really beautiful drawings telling one story that is impregnated in his memory. And it's the story of how one day in his tribe in the south of Taiwan, a group of young people contracted a mysterious disease after a field research in their homeland territories. That already kind of resonates in COVID times. This incident reminded Dakibali of the legends told by elders that certain territories should be protected from any human intervention. And from there then, from this story, he drew large-scale versions of the viruses and creatures released from wildlife as a reaction to this human intrusion. So that's kind of also really resonates in COVID times. But what I also like about his work is that it kind of makes us rethink the idea of invasive species, because the question he asks is, who is invading who? The virus, the humans, the forest, the creatures? That's kind of a different web of entanglements. So yeah, that's kind of some artworks that I just wanted to share with you. There's a lot more to discover on the Critical Zone website. And you can actually also follow our program. So the next bits of our program, if this loads, will be, for example, tomorrow we'll have a live Instagram critical break in dialogue with artists from the exhibition. Not loading, so I'm trying here. Yeah, there we go. On Thursday evening in German time, we will have a wonderful artist talk with an artist that I couldn't present right now to you because I just really wanted to give you a first impression. She's called Barbara Marcel, and she worked very closely with activists in the Amazon forest, and she will be talking to the curator, Bettina Korintenberg, and it's just a live stream in English on our website. So in case you're interested, warm welcome for you to join the talk. We also have a Telegram group where we just ask questions, and the questions from people who are following the live stream are then directly debated in the artist talk live. So exactly. And you find the rest of the program here. And yeah, I think this is where I would leave us. And if in case there are any questions, I'm really happy to take any. And if not, I can just continue scrolling so that you have another idea of what the exhibition is. Voila. Oh, and it's kind of bugging because I have too many open windows. So I'm gonna reload it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. If anybody has questions, please add them to the Q&A or mention them in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out loud.
And if not, it's really easy to discover the exhibition all by oneself. There are also really nice little invitations everywhere on the website that kind of invite you to maybe do a shift in thinking, maybe reposition yourself. For example, this one, I really like it. Lie down with one ear to the floor and listen carefully. Who and what do you hear? Even if separated by walls and floors, we all share a common ground. So that might also be kind of a poetic exercise to do in lockdown times. And I hope that these times will soon be over and more easy. All right. Stop my screen
Well, thank
share.
you so much. If nobody has any questions, I guess everybody can explore the exhibit more on their own using the links in the chat. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Tomorrow's events start on that main link again at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we have a full day breaking off into tours. And that workshop as well that was mentioned in the chat is a phenomenal self-descriptive writing workshop experience. So please do apply to participate in that if you're interested. Thank you all again, and thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Jérôme, for all of your words and this tour today.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. And thanks also for the entire day. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.